When I was a kid, everyone in my town knew the story of Mr. Waddles. He wasn't a performing clown. He was the groundskeeper at Carousel Park, an old amusement zone that had been shut down since the flood of '93. Mr. Waddles was a real person, a veteran who wore a faded, grease-stained clown suit, not for entertainment, but because he said the costume was the only thing the vandals respected. The makeup was never quite right. It was always smeared gray, like he'd been working on a furnace. My story isn't about the park, it's about the drainage tunnel. I was 17, and we used the tunnel under Route 12 to get to the reservoir to swim after dark. It was a quick 5-minute walk if you kept your head down. But one night in August, the tunnel was blocked. Not with a gate, but with a wall of junk. Old carnival wheels, rotted stuffed animals, and 1,000 deflated balloons nailed to a wooden frame. Right in the middle of the barricade was a sign painted in red, all caps. "Do not enter. The egress is occupied." We laughed because egress sounded like a clown word. We climbed over it. Halfway through the tunnel, our flashlights died. That's when we heard the squeak. It wasn't a shoe on wet concrete. It was a rubber chicken, but slow. Squeak! Squeak! It was coming from behind us, from the barricade. My buddy Mark whispered, "Mr. Waddles?" The voice that answered didn't sound like the old groundskeeper with the raspy cough. It sounded like a recording being played too slow. It said, "The park is closed. You're not wearing proper attire. Face paint is required for entry." We ran blind. Mark hit a wall and went down. I grabbed his shirt and dragged him until we saw the moon at the other end of the tunnel. We scrambled out and looked back. There, just inside the shadow of the concrete tube, was Mr. Waddles. But he was standing perfectly straight, something his arthritis never allowed. And his face? His real face was blank. The makeup was just dirt. The smile was actually just the shape of his skull under the skin. He held up a single finger to his lips. Shh. And then the tunnel went completely dark. The next morning, the barricade was gone. The tunnel was spotless. We never told anyone what we saw, but I haven't walked through a concrete tube in 20 years, and I still flinch when I hear a balloon pop.
I restore paintings for a living. Museums send me old portraits with cracked varnish, and I make them look new again. This story is about Pantalone, or at least that's what the signature on the back of the frame said. The painting was an anonymous donation to a small historical society in Maine. It was a portrait of a clown, but not a fun one. He wore a ruffled collar like something from a Renaissance court jester, and his face was painted white, with 2 perfect teardrops drawn under each eye. The eyes were black, not dark brown, black. The artist had used a heavy, almost tar-like pigment that seemed to swallow the light. My job was to clean the smoke damage from the surface. It was a tedious process with a cotton swab and a mild solvent. I had the painting on an easel in my studio for 3 weeks. That's when the crying started. I'd come in every morning, and the teardrops under his eyes would be different. Not smudged, they had moved. The painted tears were now longer, trailing down toward the corners of his mouth. I assumed it was the solvent reacting with the paint, or maybe my eyes playing tricks in the morning light. I set up a time-lapse camera overnight. The next morning, I watched the footage. For 3 hours, the painting was still. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the black pigment of the eyes blinked, and a fresh, wet-looking streak, actual liquid, rolled down the canvas from the teardrop onto the painted cheek. The liquid dripped onto the floor of the studio. It left a black, oily stain on my hardwood. I rushed to the studio. The floor was dry. The stain was gone. But the air smelled like ozone and old flowers, like a funeral home after a storm. I called the Historical Society and told them I couldn't finish the job. "He does that," the curator said over the phone, her voice flat. "We thought you could fix him. The last restorer, a woman named Margaret, said he was the saddest thing she'd ever seen. She left the painting in her attic and moved to Florida the next week. Just send him back in the crate." I never opened the crate to check if Pantalone was still crying, but I double-knotted the rope around the box before the freight truck picked it up. And for weeks after, I'd find small, black, oily spots on my studio floor, right where he used to hang.
I work night dispatch for a small county police department in rural Ohio. It's quiet work, mostly drunk drivers and the occasional loose cow on the highway. Nothing prepares you for a call at 2:47 a.m. from a number that doesn't exist. The caller ID displayed all zeros. I picked up anyway. It's policy. Static filled the line for a solid 10 seconds. Then a voice, high-pitched and cheerful, like a children's show host on a worn-out VHS tape, said, "Hello, this is an automated message from Tobin's traveling troupe. We're in your area and we'd love to visit the little ones." I almost hung up. It sounded like a spam call with a creepy gimmick. But then the voice changed. It dropped an octave, became strained, like someone was holding their nose shut. "We saw you through the window at 14 Maple Street. The boy in the dinosaur pajamas. He has a lovely smile. We'd like to borrow it." I sat up straight. 14 Maple Street was the address of a deputy on our force, a guy named Rick. He had a 6-year-old son. I'd been to his barbecue last 4th of July. His kid, Mason, had worn dinosaur pajamas to the party because he refused to change. I tried to trace the call. The system couldn't lock the location. It kept bouncing between cell towers that had been decommissioned 5 years ago. The voice continued, now with a chorus of giggles in the background. "Tobin's traveling troupe will arrive in 47 minutes. Please have the child ready. A token of entry is required. A tooth works best. A baby tooth. Still wet." I called Rick's cell immediately. It went to voicemail. I called his wife. No answer. I radioed a patrol unit to do a welfare check. Officer Daniels arrived at 3:11 a.m. He reported that the house was dark, but the front door was wide open. Rick and his family were inside, asleep. They hadn't heard anything. The door locks were intact. Nothing was missing. But on Mason's pillow, there was a single red balloon tied to a small folded note. The note was written in sparkly silver ink. "We'll try again next year. He'll lose the tooth eventually. TTT." Rick moved his family to Indiana within the month. I still have the recording of that call saved on a personal drive. I listen to it sometimes, just to make sure the voice at the end doesn't change. It hasn't yet. But the giggling? The giggling has gotten a little closer to the microphone. In the summer of 2007, I lived in a subdivision called Willow Bend. Every street was named after a flower or a tree, and every house looked exactly the same, except for the color of the shutters. It was the kind of place where you let your kids ride bikes until the streetlights came on. And every afternoon at exactly 4:15 p.m., the ice cream truck came through. The driver was a man who called himself Sprinkles. He had a real name, I'm sure, but nobody knew it. He wore a white uniform that was always pristine, and his face was painted with simple, friendly clown makeup. A red smile, blue triangles over the eyes. He was part of the neighborhood. He knew all the kids' names. He remembered their favorite treats. That was the problem. One Tuesday in late July, the ice cream truck music didn't play the usual "Pop Goes the Weasel." Instead, it played a slow, warped version of Brahms' Lullaby. It was so quiet you could barely hear it over the engine. My neighbor's daughter Ellie was the first to notice.
She ran inside crying because Sprinkles had called her by a name she'd never heard before. Her mother went out to ask him about it. The truck was parked at the curb, engine running, but the serving window was closed. She knocked. Sprinkles slid the window open just a crack. She said his makeup was smeared, and he smelled like wet earth, like he'd been digging. He handed her a free popsicle, unwrapped, with a toothpick stuck in the middle. On the toothpick was a tiny piece of paper with handwriting. "I remember your name from before, the one your parents almost gave you. Adelaide." Ellie's middle name was Adelaide. They had never told anyone. They had decided against it at the hospital and never wrote it on a single form. We called the police. They searched the truck. Inside, they found a cooler not of ice cream, but of photographs. Polaroids. Dozens of them. They were all of children from the neighborhood, taken from angles no parent would ever see. Bedroom windows, backyard swing sets, the reflection of a car door. Sprinkles was gone. He had slipped away on foot before the patrol car arrived. They found the truck abandoned in a cornfield 3 miles away, with a new sign painted on the side where the menu used to be. I know all the secret names. I moved out of Willow Bend that fall, but I still think about it every time I hear an ice cream truck, especially when the music is just a little off key, because that's when you know Sprinkles isn't selling treats. He's taking inventory, and he already has your name written down, the one you thought you kept hidden, the one your mother whispered only once, in the dark, when she thought you were asleep. First read all this story, then I will give you another task.